Welcome back, everybody. My name is Benjamin Reagan, and you are watching The Record Geek, a show for vinyl enthusiasts. We found ourselves at the Saul Zaentz Media Center in Berkeley, California, home to not only Fantasy Records and the legendary Fantasy Studios, but more importantly, to George Horn Mastering. The Fantasy label built Fantasy Studios as a musical think tank and recording facility for the bands on its roster. Most famously, Creedence Clearwater Revival recorded their catalog there. This was going to be a great segment. I know you guys are really going to love this, so enough of my yak and let's go into Fantasy Studios. I want to introduce our viewers at home to George Horn. I want to thank you. Like I said, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here today. I wondered if you could to start out a historical timeline from the inception of Fantasy and when you came to work for the studio and your role in the present day.
Well, I came to Fantasy in 1980. Fantasy, of course, is it's not the same Fantasy. Fantasy Studios is now owned by a separate corporation. And in fact, the mastering room is no longer owned by Fantasy Studios. The mastering room is owned by myself. It's George Horn Mastering.
Now, did you grow up in the Bay Area? Or were you
Yes, I'm a native San Franciscan.
Were you always set out to do what you're doing now? How did you kind of gravitate towards this vocation?
When I was a kid, I was interested in electronics, especially audio. I built amplifiers for myself and a number of other people. But I was always interested in electronics and video. Let me go back through a little bit of history on myself. I really started in professional audio as a broadcast engineer. I was with KAFE-FM. I was the chief engineer for KAFE, which is now KISS FM 98.1. And we took that station from 1,000-watt Oakland station, moved it to Sausalito, and made it a 100,000-watt San Francisco station. And I was with that station for about 4 years, at which time the station got sold, and I was injured in an automobile accident and couldn't work for about 9 months. When I recovered from the accident, I got a call from an old friend, Hank McGill, who was with the Kingston Trio Corporation, Kingston Trio Studios in San Francisco. This was in 1968. And he asked me if I wanted to come over and do some technical work for them. And I said, sure, I was interested. I wasn't really doing very much then, and I went over there and did some technical work for a few months, and Hank wound up leaving the company and went to RCA in Los Angeles. And to make a long story short, I wound up running that studio facility for a couple of years. Later, switched to Mercury Records. Mercury came to town and was working a lot at the Kingston Trio studio, and then they decided to build their own studios. So they asked me to join them and supervise the construction of their studios on Mission Street in San Francisco. They only stayed for about 2.5 years. They were mainly interested in picking up some of the San Francisco acts, and they weren't very successful at that, so they decided not to keep the studio. About that time, Columbia Records was coming to town, building their studios with Bill Putnam on Folsom Street, and I joined Columbia Records at that time in about 1970. Stayed with them till they left in 1978. Went to Los Angeles briefly to be chief engineer for Kendon Recorders down there, which was a hot mastering studio, and several recording studios as well. Then moved over to Criteria West, which was Mac Emmerman and some of his associates were building in Los Angeles, and that was about 1979 when the record business was taking a nosedive. Everybody said that the video games were taking up all the money and people were not investing in records, and so that project got scrapped halfway through, and I came back to the Bay Area. Got a call from Roy Siegel, who had worked with me at Columbia Records and was now over here at Fantasy, and Fantasy was just building their new studios, and he asked me to come to Fantasy as chief engineer. So I did that, and that was in 1980, and I've been over here ever since.
How did you gravitate towards strictly doing the mastering?
I moved over from broadcasting into audio or recording, really as a technical person. Out of necessity, I started to do some recording and some mixing for both for Frank Werber and the Kingston Trio and for Mercury Records. It's a long story as how that happened, but I then got into recording and mixing and did that for a couple of years. Now, let me back up a little bit. As a kid, I had cut records. I bought a turntable and a cutting arm and built a recording device, cutting records as a kid. So I'd had some experience in doing that. Also, with the Kingston Trio, they had a mono lathe, and I did some mastering there. But mono mastering in the late 60s was sort of passé, other than for a few 7-inch singles that were meant for broadcast. Most people were doing stereo. So I didn't do any big mastering with the Kingston Trio, but I did know how to operate the lathe. When I went to CBS was installing a lathe, or they had all the pieces there, and they asked me to put it together. And I did put the system together, and they had another person that originally was going to be the mastering engineer at CBS, but he didn't work out too well. And Roy Halley was just finishing a big record with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And he had to have it mastered, and he wanted to master it in San Francisco. He didn't want to send it to New York. So he asked me to take a shot at it. And I mastered that record for him, and he liked it a lot. And that's really how I got started in mastering. After that, at CBS, I did both technical work and mastering, not very much recording or mixing.
What advances in the technology, let's going back to those days, really helped in aiding you?
Well, I think probably automation more than anything else. In the early 70s, mastering a record, going through a side A and a side B, and having to make all the equalization changes for each song as it came up, and even sometimes in the middle of a song, was a very stressful process, because you were always picking up cues, and you had to be right on, and doing manual fades and things of that sort that had to be pretty much perfect every time. And you weren't just making one master. For CBS, a standard release would be 3 sets of masters for 3 separate plants. So you had to make a lot of passes and get all those cues just right. Nowadays, with automation, automation came in 20, 25, 30 years ago, but slowly, those changes are duck soup, because you can set them up in advance and it just happens. Yeah. So you can make a much better record.
Now, I wanted to ask, with making 3 sets of masters, now would that mean that in those days you couldn't effectively, and pardon me if I seem ignorant, but you couldn't effectively copy a master once you made? You had to make 3 individual sets of masters, right? I mean, you set one and you make another. So could there would be, correct me if I'm wrong, there'd be differentiations between the two. I mean, slight, but there could be at least.
There could be, but
If it's done correctly, there's
but
not.
you tried not to. If you had a problem, if you missed a cue, you'd scrap it and put on another lacquer. And it wasn't 3; it was 3 sets for 3 different plants, so it was 9 of each side.
3 for each plant.
And in some cases, many more than that. For Paul Simon, I mastered for the world for him. There were, I think, 60 sets of lacquers that were cut for one of the Paul Simon albums.
In terms of mastering, as we've seen the rise of digital forms of recording and mastering, do you think that that cutting a record and doing analog mastering is a dying art?
There's been somewhat of a resurgence in the analog record for albums. Collectors and other people that are interested in that. How long it's going to last, I don't know. I thought the analog record would disappear 15 years ago, and it didn't. The DJs kept it alive for a long time because there were many, many DJ records made, more than LPs. Now the LP is coming back somewhat. There's still interest in the LP, and I'm still making them.
Do you think the sound quality now is, with digital recording, that it's a cut above? Do you think it's the quality is still there?
Well, people have a lot of different feelings about that. But I can tell you this, that you can take an analog record, transfer it to a good digital system, play them back simultaneously, switch back and forth, and people can't tell you which is which. So that to me means that the analog record will fit inside of the digital recording. Now if you do the opposite, that won't be true. If you took a digital recording and transferred it to an analog record and played them both back simultaneously, you would hear a difference.
And if it's a style of music that you're not accustomed to, what do you do to make sure it's coming out right, or is that all done in the engineering?
Well, that's experience. With experience, you deal with all different types of music. In the early 70s, with Columbia Records, the challenge was to make a record that sounded like the tape. Now this is important because at that time, the studio engineers, Roy Halley, the engineers that were mixing the records, mixed it the way they wanted it. The producers and the engineers mixed it the way they wanted it. And the challenge for the mastering engineer in 1971 was to make a record that would sound just like the tape. Now that changed in the late 70s. In the late 70s, the mastering engineer was expected to equalize the record and correct certain things that were not true in the early 70s. And this is because as recording developed fast in the 70s, people started mixing songs at various studios and at various times, and so they weren't as consistent from song to song, and the mastering engineer had to correct a lot of that. So the challenge later became for the mastering engineer to correct the equalization on all of the songs and make it flow like a record. And that's true today. That's what we do. That's the primary thing that we do. Well, what I often tell people, and when people ask me what the mastering process is all about, I'll say, in the studios, in the recording studio, they bake the cake. They bring it to the mastering engineer, and he puts the icing on it and finishes it off.